Jeanne Sarson and Linda MacDonald have spent decades developing ways of offering care and protection to women who desperately need it. As the description for their new book, Women Unsilenced, Our Refusal to Let Torture Traffickers Win, points out, they've made it their goal to break the silence, the tyranny of silence by which gender-based violence persists. They explain in this conversation that they developed a network of care for women in these circumstances because they couldn't just passively take in the information. They needed to intervene. And while I don't agree with every single one of the claims that they make in Women Unsilenced, I absolutely respect their fundamental motivation. There is an attachment in their book, and you'll hear it in this conversation, there is an attachment to the criminal justice system, a sense that we can't necessarily quickly move away from the system that we have. I feel somewhat differently and agree with my next guest for the podcast, Ardath Whynacht, that this violence in some ways comes from living in a carceral society that, quote, relies on binary categories of good and evil to avoid any sustained response to the causes of domestic violence. But I absolutely agree with their sense that care networks are vital for providing an alternative space of safety outside of that punishing individualistic society, outside of the coordinates of possibility provided by patriarchy, white supremacy, misogyny, domination. We cover a wide range of topics here. It's not an easy conversation. We talk about the ways in which victimization dehumanizes people. We talk about what it means to, as Jeanne puts it, rescue the act of caring in a society that doesn't just dismiss but even criminalizes caring in certain ways. They talk about the ways in which their own place in the story is crucial to how they theorize gender-based violence, how they understand the persistence of torturing and trafficking and objectification. And I ask them how they cope through the work that they do, and they make it clear that for them it's not a question of coping, it's a question of responsibility. You can find Women Unsilenced in bookstores in Halifax and online at Friesen Press. The chapters of the book are replete with details that are gathered from meetings at kitchen tables, face-to-face encounters that are about trying to connect with those that have been made to feel deeply disconnected from humanity. It's a wide-ranging and, as I say, fairly difficult conversation, so please do be aware that we are going to be talking about gender-based violence. We're going to be talking about subjects that not everyone is going to be comfortable discussing, but we discuss that too. What it means to be in a society where these subjects are rarely talked about because they are taboo or because they are too overwhelming. I had a really intense, invigorating time reading your book, of course, and reading it in the context of larger feminist discourses on femicidal violence, on intimate partner violence, on the escalation of these forms of violence. And in terms of that, I recently read an article in the Tyranny entitled "A Key Role for Media in the Fight Against Femicide," and I wanted to kind of start with this question of representation, since you're sort of intervening with this book in a discourse that is about representation. So they say in that article, quote, "In covering femicide, media have a leading role, not only in awareness and education generally, but in actively shaping the construction of attitudes and beliefs that can help prevention efforts." So the article, is suggesting that it's actively harmful to represent this form of violence as something that's isolated or individualized. And I mean, this is in the context of, a pop culture that both of you have noted celebrates in some ways the torture of women, or at least normalizes the torture of women. Movies like the Suicide Squad or Black Widow or the Hateful Eight come to mind, but they're just some in a series of these sorts of representations that I think normalize violence. I want to ask, like, what's your sense of the role that media representation plays in determining the social reality of gender-based violence?
Well, media is part of freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of democracy. So media is crucial to the role of exposing the crime of torture of women and girls, and to stop sexualizing and romanticizing, the reality of torture. Like 50 Shades of Grey is a
Right.
good example. I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
whole book, and then turned into a movie. And now we're seeing the young woman everywhere she goes that was in the movie, followed, and probably the torture fantasies that people think of when they see her. It really bothers me because media can do just the opposite. And really, right now, media is not doing the opposite. We're having a hard time to get media to listen to us, to talk about our book. But it's the foundation of culture, media, and democracy. So I think it's really crucial.
And to that, Scott, I would add the saying that we hear many times, that it takes a whole village or a community to raise a child.
Mm-hmm.
So the media is part of that community. And if the media silences the truth, then we have to hold ourselves to account, the media included. And that's why we wrote the book, because it does take a community to raise a child, and we would not agree to the silencing. And that's why we keep working, trying to make connections with media, so the media will join us as a community, making the world safer.
Yeah, and it sounds like a serious challenge, sort of in a way educating the media, because there's this, I think, really entrenched resistance to difficult subjects, to subjects that you imagine are going to sort of turn off your audience, or often the claim is re-traumatize your audience. And this is something that when you both spoke on the podcast last time, you addressed, really well. And I was just thinking about this a bit more in relationship to the book, and actually this interview that I saw with the director of the film Procession. So Procession is this documentary that's about the scandal of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. The director of that film, Robert Greene, recently discussed the fear of re-traumatization in covering these stories of child sexual abuse. He was speaking with The Hollywood Reporter, and Greene said that in making his documentary, he was trying to give those that have experienced trauma the ability to control the narrative, to communicate their truth. And for this reason specifically, he says the experience was not re-traumatizing. What he says is that trauma is really the result of taking power away. So you can't re-traumatize when you give power, because that is what trauma is. It's the denial of power. And so he says, like, just giving people power to make their own representational choices was empowering. And to that end, like, Women Unsilenced contains a vast array of drawings and art. And I want to ask why you felt it was important to empower women to use, in a way, graphic medicine or art-based therapy to work through trauma.
Well, again, Scott, I think I would use a stronger word than trauma, because in our book we call it victimization. Victimization means there's a violation that has occurred, that a crime has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we stop the freedom of speech in a way that women who joined us in the book were saying, this makes me feel so important. This makes me feel that I'm a person with a voice. This makes me feel that I'm being heard, that I'm being seen, that I'm being listened to. Those are all not trauma related issues. Those are their own issues of claiming their dignity, claiming their right to be seen as persons on this planet. So for us, the book is very positive, and it is very positive for the women in this regard. And the reason their art is in there is because sometimes their ability to find the right words and the right emotion to express the victimization that they survived, that the best way they find to do it is through visual expression. And that's why we have so many of their drawings or their art forms in the book, because it speaks louder about their reality.
And the women, they can put the book down. They don't have to keep reading, or they can skip over stories if they don't want to read stories. So people have the power to read the book the way they like. They don't have to start at the beginning. They could start in the middle. They could only read the theory part. There's many ways that the book can be read, because it's a composite of our stories, the women's stories, and the theory, and all the different scientific models that we develop. So it's really a collection of different ways of knowing in one. I wanted to go back to the media just for a minute and say that another reason why we're thinking that the media is a blocker, because it is, except for some dedicated journalists, is also there's informal networks. And the informal networks are comprised of perpetrators, and they have access to the media and all the other structures in society, and they influence the decisions of all the gatekeepers of democracy. Just like we know about Weinstein and Epstein, they're considered informal networks. Well, we were connected to knowing some of the organized crime and the informal networks. So we can't ever rule out the impact that those networks have on freedom of speech. That's another form of corruption that people probably aren't considering.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're right that, and so like the responsibility becomes like, how do you make visible those informal networks of perpetrators? And I think like the argument often is that, the kind of new network feminist movement represented by something like Me Too is an attempt to create a kind of care network, a source of collective power that can, destabilize those like patriarchal forms of kind of network power that allow abusers to keep abusing.
That's right. You have to have a network to undo a network.
Yeah. And on that point, like there's this really, vociferous argument in the book for care as a means of restoring people's sense of self-worth, fighting worthlessness basically through care. There's a line in the book that I wanted to read where you write, the torturer's actions can leave victims struggling with the emotional feelings of worthlessness, so worthless that suicide feels like their only way out. This made me think of the ways in which Amanda Todd and Retea Parsons, in particular, I think, have haunted political discussions of the vulnerability of young women in Canada since their suicides in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, respectively. They really became representative of this crisis of cyberbullying and its violent effects. And both girls ended their lives because they couldn't escape the universal condemnation of their peers at the time. And what's interesting though, in terms of the legacy, the ways in which those deaths, those suicides have haunted the discourse, is that, there was this outrage, right? Parsons' suicide, particularly in Halifax, generated an enormous amount of rage, I think, and for good reason. The case was originally, in fact, dismissed by the police, and I want to come back to that question of the police a little bit later in our discussion. But that case was reopened specifically as a result of public pressure, and so it's clear, like from reading your book, that given that you're calling for spaces of protection for women, for victims, for people to not feel simply condemned for having been victimized, like, to what extent do you feel like the power of care networks is partly about, as you put it, Jeanne, in the book, rescuing care, like rescuing it from what perhaps is the question, like where has care gone from your point of view?
Well, if we're talking with and about the women that are in the book with us, I guess if we wanted to think about rescuing as a social responsibility, I would define the rescuing then that people read the book. That people, Linda and I have said to people, if you want to have further discussion when you're reading the book as a group, that we'd sit down and Skype or Zoom with individuals to talk that through.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues about rescuing is that we have never apologized for writing the book and telling the truth. I think when you talk about rescuing, we have to value truth telling. For some reason, as a species, we have a tendency to want to silence the truth. You know, if we're Linda and I, in some ways, and the women in the book are whistleblowing, and people say, well, I can't read the book or I don't want to read the book. But we have to change that response to know that knowing the truth is about rescuing, if you will, socially, the silence that makes this type of organized crime, this type of family victimization okay. Because it becomes okay with silence. And to do the opposite, which is in the book that Linda and I said, we learned to do the opposite of what the torturers do, is to speak up. And that was, I guess that's the social rescuing that's in the book, is that
Mm-hmm.
we have never been silent.
And I don't consider what happened to Ratea and I forget Amanda's Todd as dying by suicide. I see it as a form of femicide. They were really left no choice. The structures were so cruel to them, blaming them for all of the violations that they endured, and not holding the perpetrators or the peers around the perpetrators or society accountable. And I mean, they were just driven to die by suicide under a femicidal, condition. It was just, it's heart wrenching to think of it. And if we had had a caring society around them, I don't believe they would have ever have chosen suicide ever. I don't think they did choose it. I think they were driven to it.
Yeah, I agree. And a caring, perhaps rather than just like punitive or carceral society. And Jeanne, you were saying that there's this like desire to silence the truth, to like marginalize, especially like difficult knowledge. And this is something you take up in the book, I think, in terms of the ways in which trauma is pathologized. So you say globally, all forms of violence against women and girls continue to be dismissed as unfounded, as deserved, as asked for, or for women so tortured, they risk being treated as mentally ill. And so you say you refuse to accept being told or labeled with a mental illness. And you say, like, this is the reason for revising the victim blaming term PTSD to the more accurate term post traumatic stress response to identify responses to victimization. And this made me think of there's a piece, an essay called Traumatic Monologues by Melanie Yazzie, where she writes that too often these kinds of social justice projects aren't seen as structural problems. They're mired in these like neoliberal ideas about healing as something that one does primarily as an individual. Like what's your sense as people that are, you know, trained as nurses, but who have now engaged in this kind of discourse around trauma, victimization, and healing, of like the limits of PTSD as a discourse and how it might be rooted in this like very individualized and very isolated way of dealing with trauma?
Well, first of all, I think it's very wrong. It's very patriarchal because that's what happens to women and girls. We're blamed for the patriarchy. We're blamed for being blamed for everything. And perpetrators get off scot-free. I mean, I grew up in violence. I fought my way through violence, and I know I was not mentally ill. I have no doubt in my mind that I would get depressive and get down and discouraged and hurt and anguished and desolate and all those feelings. But none of them are a mental illness. I mean, what do you expect little girls or adults who are trapped in torture families to feel? I mean, why that we think that we have the right to pathologize those normal, healthy feelings and responses is just outrageous. So it's all about the patriarchy, and that's what we tried to do in the book, is to show patriarchy and how wrong and how grave an injustice it is for women and girls, and to show another way for women and girls who want to think differently. Now, if people want to claim a mental illness, that's their right. I'm not saying that. This is just my opinion, and it's Jeanne's opinion. We're not saying it's the only way, but we're saying it's the way. It was the way for us, and more people are saying it too. There's more and more challenging around the structures and the pathologizing that's going on, and to call it a disorder when really it's just a normal response. So that wave is growing, and I find that really inspiring to know that, especially for young people, hopefully they won't grow up with the same kind of I mean, I did end up self-blaming myself in ways that I shouldn't have. If I'd been brought up in a non-patriarchal society and not seen my feelings, my responses to the violence as my fault, I would have been a much different person and wouldn't have had so much work to do. So I'm really hoping that young people, young women, and when teenagers, if they read our book, they throw off all the self blame and self doubt and worry about their mind, and know that it's the people around them that are wrong, it's the structures around them that are wrong, it's the uncaring reality of the world that is wrong, and they know that it's not their fault.
As you were asking the question, I kind of jumped into the book around the whole issue that we wrote in the book that, is caring. We can do it person to person, if you will. And for us, for Linda and I, and in the book and the women that we were supporting, we were caring in many different ways, like we described, advocating and problem solving and educating around the inequality of women and girls, and gave them information to start undoing the lies and the distortion that they were so victimized by. But what came to me as you were asking that question is writing in the book that as hard as we worked and as hard as the women worked, to just kind of say, okay, go out into society that doesn't give a damn, because they're not listening. And that presents a whole layer of hard and painful work. And it shouldn't be that that society should be excused from caring. And it took me to the social again around that we live in a country called Canada. And as much as Linda and I have tried to have the political structure of Canada understand what torture victimization means, to be always confronted with rejection or a different argument that said, well, if you're tortured by state actors, which would be like a police or military, that's more important. What can be more important than the girls you just mentioned that ended up being so uncared about that they committed suicide? So we have to bring the whole issue of caring, not only person to person, but in society in general.
Right. And you're providing sort of a macro political perspective to some extent in the book, in part by just using that term non-state actors, which is a term that has strong connections to like national security and a kind of militaristic view of geopolitics. Like a rogue state like the Taliban would be considered a non-state actor, but you're using it to talk about like domestic violence, which is an example of, I think, the book's attempt to sort of invent a language of care to some extent, and talk about the politics of, as you say, warring men being protected from torture by law, but not women who are in these vulnerable positions. But I wanted to come back to one thing I think Linda said about moving past mental illness as a framework toward a more inclusive framework that identifies the toxic nature of the structure itself, a world that doesn't care, or that excuses us from caring, as you said, Jeanne. Like, part of that structure is what the late Bell Hooks, called imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, right? So, there's a line in Women Unsilenced where you say healthy caring is about living in a society that nurtures social inclusion, non-discrimination, non-violence, and respect for human dignity. And that made me think of the other book that just recently came out by Ardath Whynacht from Fernwood Press, Insurgent Love, which is also in some ways about exposing misogynistic violence, intimate partner violence. And in that book, she argues that while, exposing misogyny and the misogynistic roots of femicidal violence is incredibly important work, it sometimes ignores the roots of misogyny in settler colonialism and racial capitalism. She says stopping the analysis at misogyny risks, quote, concealing the complicity of white feminists in structures that uphold the very violence they're seeking to disrupt. It says that we actually need to account for the ways in which our white ancestors brought structures of objectification and possessiveness, seen both, she says, through the ways in which the land itself has been objectified and stolen and possessed. And she says we have to make sure that we don't lose that from the conversation when we're talking about how to tackle gender-based violence, given that possessiveness and objectification are part of what really drives the severity and of the violence, right? And I guess I wanted to ask, like, where's your thinking at in terms of how your book intervenes on the questions of like race and intersectionality, right? This particular quote where you're talking about how healthy caring really relies on non-discrimination and social inclusion. Could you expand on what you're saying in that passage, maybe in relationship to what Whynacht is arguing?
Well, we were just talking this week with a woman from South India who
Mm-hmm.
advocates for women and young women who were child brides in
Right.
India. So, non-state torture is a global reality that happens to all women and girls all over the world, regardless of their race, regardless of their culture, regardless of their tradition, regardless of the economics of the country. It's all based on patriarchy. So patriarchy in itself is a global tradition, and it's rooted in misogyny. And the most grave human right violation globally in the world is violence against women and girls. It really is. And if you mentioned about security and national security, it's an indicator of national security. We're not going to ever be safe as a country if we're going to be violent to women and girls. So we're very open to thinking about our work applying to all women and girls, and we're respectful of the differences in each culture and each tradition and each country. But really, there is never an excuse. Tradition or race or culture is never an excuse for torture, ever. It's an irreducible crime and human rights violations, and we stand strong against it.
Yeah, that notion of an irreducible crime, like something that is just irrefutably, you use the language of evil in the book. And I mean, like, even the fact of the RCMP's history, right? The RCMP is a colonial power that used strategic violence to pacify the country and steal land. I mean, that's just the fact of this history. The question of whether it persists in the present is a different maybe question. I think that's when the discourse gets very polarizing, right? And like, Judith Butler and other feminists acknowledge that there is, of course, like aggression in the human genome, but the way that aggression is expressed and the social structures that either deal with violence in a socially just way or simply punish it, like that has a big part to play, apparently, according to some of these theorists, in determining who is impacted by violence. Like, one of the things that Whynacht says, for example, in relationship to the National Day of Remembrance and Action that just took place on, that is to say, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women that just took place here in Canada on December 6th, the commemoration of the Polytechnique massacre. Whynacht says, on December 6th, we can honor victims by abolishing the carceral system that failed to prevent the killer's violence, right? So like, that is not about just sort of, criminalizing a deranged misogynist, though of course, like, that is appropriate in some ways. It's about trying to couch that argument against misogyny in discriminatory, patriarchal, and misogynistic polities and practices that actually reinforce torturers' message that social political structures don't care, basically, right?
Mm.
And like, this is the thing I guess I wanted to ask you about in terms of how the book brings together this political argument and your own personal accounts, right? Because Jeanne, at one point you say that, when the police left your house and your father like continued his rage, you used to wonder why the police did nothing, right? And you say this social neglect hurt sometimes as much as the family violence. So, I mean, how can we move past? Is it possible to move past this model that just relies on the police to punish, that relies on criminalization and punishment, this sort of carceral feminism? Is there a more kind of community safety oriented model that can replace that sort of carceral feminism with something more progressive?
Well, I certainly don't believe in criminalizing vulnerable people, and I certainly do believe that colonialism has criminalized persons of color, Black people and persons of color. I won't deny that. I mean, it's atrocious what's going on. And colonialism has affected the whole world, not just North America. I mean, you look at India and you look at Africa and the colonialism and what it's done there. So colonialism is horrible. And I wouldn't even call the residential schools. I call them centers of cruelty. So I'm not denying the power of and the wrong, how wrong colonialism is. And I certainly also don't agree with a lot of the police tactics now. And of course, Jane Gerster in the book that she's writing is talking about the paramilitary, and that's the history that the RCMP came from. So we really do have to change that. And we have to change it by other ways other than education, because obviously that's not working. They have to have serious consequences, whether it's suspension with no pay, being fired, no promotions, all kinds of much more serious sanctions to hold these misogynistic, militaristic police accountable. So that's definitely. But for the people that we know, the women that we know, they're perpetrators, they're parents, they're people of privilege in society. They have no place walking the streets. So I would never agree that prisons shouldn't be part of a caring society. It probably is that we have the wrong people in prison most times, because none of them have gone to jail. None of them have even gone to court because the women are too traumatized by how uncaring society is to ever dare take them to court. But they are such evil people. Their actions are so evil. I don't believe they're redeemable in any way with education or caring. And I think we have to accept that there is a component of society, of human beings, that are gone way beyond any redeemable rehabilitation. And I would like to see some of them in prison. But what I'd really like to see is that we start getting to prevention, which is to educate children when they're very young, even as toddlers and in preschool, about caring, and move away from the patriarchy and the colonialism and the uncaring societies in that way. But we have to do it all together. It can't be just one intervention, because it's going to take a long time for the education to take hold. So that's why we're pushing for the legal changes, because maybe some of the women will feel strong enough to take their perpetrators to court, and we'll start seeing some of them in jail where they should be.
Yeah, I mean, there has been certainly a surge in the reporting of sexual assault since Me Too, and that has everything to do, reports have shown, with a greater sense that you will be supported if you come forward, which is like inherently powerful. And what I hear you saying, Linda, is that you really want to try and grasp at the roots of these problems, and that's to me what I hear some of these theorists advocating for, like For example, in the Manifesto Feminism for the 99%, they talk about this mistaken assumption that the laws, police, and courts can maintain sufficient autonomy from power structures to actually fight gender violence, right? So, like, if the only institutions we have for holding, to use your term, torture traffickers accountable are themselves complicit with violence. In fact, like productive of violence. It becomes necessary to sort of maybe abolish the system and create something totally new, a caring society. But sorry, Jeanne, I didn't give you a chance to jump in there.
Well, Scott, you started with asking me about how I felt when the police came to our
Mm-hmm.
house. And of course, I was just a kid. So the whole issue of inequality and structural inequality was not something I understood there at that time because, I was so little. I came to understand it more and more, and sometimes it takes us quite a while to fully understand the society in which we are. I don't believe in abolishing what we have because I don't know if we're skilled enough yet to create an absolutely perfect social structure of any form. Um, I think that's an evolutionary process for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was not only colonialism as we know it. There were many forms in many different countries of how patriarchal power evolved. And so I think we have to have many ways of knowing to challenge truthfully the root of misogyny and the root of how patriarchy became a normal way of functioning.
Martha Nussbaum, for example, has talked about how the subjugation of women in some ways has been based on their relative size in relationship to men. So, like, presumably there's like a biological
Mm.
element that needs to be accounted for. Sylvia Wynter, the critical race theorist Sylvia Wynter, talks about how we are both, of course, a biological species, but also a fundamentally storytelling species.
Mm.
Yeah, you kind of can't have one perhaps without the other. And maybe on that point, I wanted to talk about or tease out some of the book's engagement with how you position yourself in this story. There's clearly room left in the book for thinking through like your place in the stories of those that you have rescued through care and some of the strategies of survival that you've developed. So, like for example, on page 74, you recount this harrowing story of falling asleep while driving because you just exhausted yourself, being present to someone, and you talk at the very end of the book about how you cope. And there's this, lovely passage where you talk about how it's a question you're asked all the time. And that, for you, a lifelong way of coping has always been just talking, and that's never been more vital. That's something that I find to be such like a simple and powerful insight. This idea that just speaking together, especially face to face, I know that's difficult in the pandemic, but like that is the means through which transformation happens is through this kind of sharing, this truth telling. Um, I wondered if you could just like reflect on that specific story about how and why you position yourself in the book as like part of the story and what you learned about the power of talk by writing the book.
Well, we positioned ourselves in the book because we're part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And it was important, we felt, when we worked with the women, and still do, we don't see ourselves as separate from them, that we're, that they're objectified in some way, I guess. We're the counselor
Mm-hmm.
and they're the whatever people think of them as, the client or something. We just see ourselves as women talking together, and that we have some wisdom to share, and that they have wisdom to share, and how we work that through together. And we felt it was important for people to understand our story too, to understand why we work the way we do, because without our story, probably they wouldn't have understood it the same. I don't know, did it help you to read our story to see how our work evolved?
No, I thought those were some of the most compelling moments in some ways of the book. Like in the epilogue, where you say, where you kind of you're talking about how people assume that you needed to distance yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say, you were just talking about this, like you refused to use the title term of the book. You refused to distance or disconnect yourself from the reality, which is, a difficult and exhausting thing, an overwhelming thing to do. You say, when you imagine your role, you picture yourself standing right in the midst of the horrors with the women who have survived.
Yeah.
That has to be part of the reason why you just fell asleep at the wheel, because it's just unbelievably draining. That's why we can only speculate, but that has to be part of the reason why we exist in a society that does allow and even encourage this silencing, right? It is undeniably overwhelming, but necessary, right?
Well, see, the thing is, I don't find it overwhelming to be part, because that's the only way I know. I I learned that when I was little, and I couldn't do the work any other way anyway, Scott. I couldn't. I mean, it's exhausting, but it's not overwhelming. It would be overwhelming for me to want to try to distance myself. I could not do it. I'm not capable of that, because that's not the way I take in the world. I think when I was little, I was so bereft, that story about the daisy, and so bereft. Um, I That's the way I function myself. I took in the world. I became part of the world, and that's the way I've lived my life. And I realize that in that sense, it's made me an outsider in many ways that I wasn't really aware of. But I think women tell us, and you're telling us, that it was important for them too, because they can identify with the story, because they feel that they went with us in the story. And some women say it helped them in their own life, and their understanding of why they were doing what they were doing, or understanding about evil. So then the reader grows as they're reading. It's not an objective act. You're not just reading a story. You're part of the story. And that was the brilliance of the way Jeanne wrote the book, to bring them along in the story. And to me, that's just part of our participatory research, at the kitchen table or in the book. And it's just our natural way of being. When you say, Jeanne?
Yes, I think it's sometimes, and maybe often, easier to be violent than it is to care. But if we could undo the easier to be violent with it becomes easier to care, it wouldn't be so hard. I mean, very quick, I think of drivers who get, road rage, and they're cursing and swearing and sticking up their finger at you. That's like being ready to fight instead of stopping and think now.
I think that's a great example. Yeah.
Is that respectful?
There was just an instance of road rage in the Maritimes. It made the rounds on CBC. Did you read about this? It was about like how the social norm of the zipper merge is not well understood.
I know. I just couldn't believe that.
And like this guy tried to use the zipper merge, but it was interpreted as an aggressive act as he was trying to like butt in line. And a guy in a white cube truck just marched in traffic to this guy's car and punched the back window out of his car, right?
Yeah.
And it's like it's hard to account in a way for like those acts of aggression, either A, without gesturing to some like biological impulse to be violent, right? So he was triggered by this perceived slight, and was like seething presumably in the car, and rather than finding a way to like reconcile his anger with just his situation, he decided to externalize that, to weaponize it, and terrorize this guy, right? And so it's like I've been obsessing a little bit about this seemingly trivial news story, because I think you're right. It does indicate that we live in a society where it is in some ways easier to be violent. When you're stuck in gridlock, when the actual like built environment seems hostile and toxic, it's not easy to care. It's not easy to like swallow rage, which might be a naturally occurring chemical thing. Like the structure of society itself seems to make us violent.
And there are many examples like whistleblowing. We have whistleblowers who try to make the world better, and who gets attacked but the whistleblower. It's that social construction of how it seems that it's so easier to hunt and be angry than it is to care. So that's why I think if we could read the book and people could look at it, okay, this is a caring act. This is not to be considered an atrocity that I want to distance, but this should be a caring act that I welcome to understand and help myself emotionally grow into a different way of understanding the violence that our society perpetrates. So I think we have to learn. We have to learn and evolve how to care, and it would be simpler, I think. It wouldn't be so hard as Linda and I wrote in the book.
That's what feminism is, really. True feminism, I think it's an act of caring. Because, to understand that as a woman, as a girl, that I'm thought of as less than, that I'm objectified, that my value is not equal, and to live with that reality, and yet to work to try to change that for not just me, but for my children and men and boys. That's a very patient act. And I think I learned that as a child, because I knew that I didn't want to be violent like my father. I knew that was the wrong way to go. So I pushed my brain to a different way. And we have to go beyond the biology that, that women are physically smaller, or we have less testosterone, or we don't have the same bone structure, and all of those biological things that historically, when we were in caves, when we were out fighting for our lives, we had to be quite brutal, I think, as a species to survive. But we're not there anymore. We have to go beyond the biology. We have to go to our brains and to relational awareness and to caring. And we're capable of that. And it's a learned behavior. I don't think we're doomed as a species, but you have the climate crisis, and we have COVID. We have all kinds of things that are pushing us in ways that we've never had to go before. And I'm hoping that enough of us will come out of this much more caring. That's my belief.
Yeah, that's my hope too. And many people are trying to kind of, many people who believe in care are trying to like leverage this moment to point out that the neoliberal state really wasn't equipped to care, right? And I mean, just look at the crisis in long-term care facilities as one example, right? Like, it is an uncaring society in part because, and to your point, Jeanne, like I think it's easier to hunt now. Like it feels like it's like that's the more natural impulse because of the social Darwinist conditions of capitalism. I mean, of a competitive, capitalist, individualistic kind of society. I mean, the pedagogy that we receive early on in life, even in the family, is that you kind of have to make it on your own. I mean, part of the structure that limits care, I think, is the family itself. And this is, something you're talking about in the book. Linda, you narrate this moment of having an epiphany where you no longer are deferent to your parents. And I think that is, I wanted to pick up on that because we've reflected a lot on the importance of the family. To what extent you feel that the family itself is kind of implicated in the reproduction of these really unequal relationships of power, right? Like, people like Kathy Weeks have written about the family in ways that are just like pretty much abolitionist, like basically saying that Weeks at one point writes that the heteropatriarchal family may function as a haven in a heartless world for some, but for others it's a sad and dangerous sight. So like the police, in a way, the family is an institution that inspires a certain level of emotional attachment. Like people don't want to let go of it. And I've had many conversations with people who can't imagine what it would mean to defund or abolish the police. Jeanne, you were kind of talking about this. Linda, like seeing a place for prison. Do you think that, just like the carceral system, the neoliberal structure of the family that says we can't have families that like are networked families, we all have to kind of have our own domestic spaces of the home that are isolated. Like, To what extent do you think that itself needs to be interrogated, examined, and even maybe dismantled?
Well, the family is the foundation of patriarchy. That's where it's taught. So we have to transform families, and that's what our book is about. Is exposing the worst that happens in families. Stop thinking about that stranger over with the white van. I mean, I know there are those, and they're part of the problem, but the core of violence happens in families.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we have to start becoming honest about our families. And that's why I was proud to do that, because my family was not a good family. And how are children and young people going to learn that it's okay to talk about your family if we don't start role modeling that? And if we all go around pretending that we have perfect families, we're going to stay in patriarchy forever.
So we have to kind of demystify the family.
Absolutely.
And talk about the actual patterns that exist. Like I've mentioned Whynacht's book, Insurgent Love, a number of times. One of the things she points out is that like we've known the patterns, the social trends that lead to intimate partner violence, that lead to femicide for at least 25 years. We know exactly what the predictors are. The problem in part is that we're deploying police when we should be deploying care workers, right, who understand the warning signs and perceive the patterns within a family structure. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add before we end today?
Well, I can add there that I think it has to be everywhere. I don't think we should get rid of the police, but they have to start paying attention to the red flags. And we have to have more care workers, and we have to look at every structure in patriarchy and transform it to one based in equality, and start rooting out about misogyny. We have to really get serious about misogyny and what a cruel force it is in the world, and how it affects not just women and girls, but men and boys as well.
I mean, even in the police force and in the military. I mean, the reckoning right now in the Canadian military, something like 19,000 complaints are being apologized for currently. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the level of misogyny even within these institutions is it's shocking.
Yeah, misogyny is rampant.
So what I would add, Scott, is that we really have to take on a global deconditioning of our species of patriarchy. We have to just say we've all been born into patriarchy, and every structure and every person has been conditioned into patriarchy. You can only change patterns of behavior with awareness. So what does patriarchal conditioning mean? How does that play out within our own belief systems, our own actions, our own thoughts and attitudes around others who are different than we are? All that is about finding ways to deconstruct the patriarchy that we've all been born into. That issue of having to think through what it is we're doing every day, how we're progressing with care, or how we're progressing with more oppression and more harm. Mm-hmm. So it's a very socially conscious effort that we have to engage in.
And I appreciate you, putting yourselves into this book in the way that you have, and making the time to talk to me today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your interest and your caring.